Now then, how are you doing? I hope you're well. If you're new to watercolour, then there's one simple fact, one that governs almost everything we do in the medium, that you will have to come to terms with, and that is we work from light to dark. Well, a common issue that newcomers often fall prey to is that of your painting losing its vibrancy and things becoming muddy. Sound familiar? Well, if it does, relax. It happens to everybody at some point or another. Well, if it's gone muddy, it probably means it's lacking any significant highlights. So let's take a look at that. Key highlights can be created in many different ways, 4 of which I'm going to cover right now. Oh, just to be clear, you may be wondering why I haven't included the use of white paint to create highlights. Of course, you can use white paint if you want to, but I can tell you that it will never look as clean and white and bright as the pure, untouched white of the paper. Okay, let's see those 4 methods in action. Starting with a rather magnificent cactus I stumbled across in Sicily. Our cactus is a large, solid-looking object, mostly a pale green colour, all of which shouldn't prove to be too much of a problem. The tricky bit is going to be all those sharp spines. They're very fine and would be difficult to paint around, particularly if I also want to include that blurry background. In short, this is the perfect job for masking fluid. What's masking fluid, I hear you ask? Well, I can tell you that it's a rubber-based medium that you can apply like paints to selected parts of your painting. By doing so, you're essentially protecting those areas. It means that you can paint over the top of them in the full knowledge that those areas are safe. There are a few downsides you should probably know about. Firstly, some papers don't take kindly to it, and removing it can be a problem. Secondly, well, it's unkind to brushes. Don't use your best sable brush for the job. It's better to use an old brush or a ruling pen, as you see me doing here. The truth is, some folks love it and use it all the time, while others avoid it like the plague. The fact that it preferably needs to be applied right at the start of the planning process means it can take away some of the spontaneity. Also, by its very nature, masking fluid creates hard edges, so it isn't so good for subtle gradients, although they can be faked and added in later. When you're ready and your wash has dried, simply remove the masking with your finger or an eraser and voila! The shapes you painted are preserved as white, untouched paper. A lovely, clean, white, bright highlight, in fact. Oh, just one other thing. It is worth knowing that if it's old and gone a bit lumpy, masking fluid can be thinned out with water. So, your cactus is almost finished, but then you notice that you forgot to mask out a few of its spines, or it's looking a little sparse in the old spine department. What then? Well, my advice would be to scratch them out. I always like to have a craft knife kicking around for this very purpose. And scratching out is exactly as its name suggests. It is something that needs to be done with care though. Obviously, you don't want to go lopping the ends of your fingers off, that could be very messy, and blood is difficult to get out of watercolour paper. What I really mean by care though is use a light touch. The aim is to remove pigment from the surface of the paper without damaging it if possible, so only use the lightest of pressure at first, increasing it as required. A light touch also enables you to control the cleanliness of the resulting highlight. Go in there like a bull at a gate and you'll probably end up removing far more than you intended. So, how else can we create highlights? Masking fluid sounds perfect, doesn't it? And if I've always got a craft knife to hand, then I'm also geared up to scratch out highlights. Surely I'm covered. Maybe, but there is another way. Shapes can be produced by painting around them just as easily as painting them directly. We call this process negative painting. Remember, in watercolour, we work from light to dark. This means that ideally we should endeavour to plan out where our highlights are going to go right from the very beginning. Well, meticulously painting around light objects is about as hands-on as it gets. The ability to create shapes negatively on the fly, as it were, is a skill worth practicing and refining. Well, first off though, let's take a look at what negative painting actually is. To help you understand what negative painting is, I recommend this very simple exercise. Anyone can do it. All it requires is a bit of patience. In other words, don't rush it. And it goes a little bit like this. Let's say we want to create a simple rectangle. Instead of painting one directly, try conjuring one up by painting around the shape. In other words, applying paint to everywhere except the shape we're wanting to create. Once you've done that and the wash has dried, let's add a second rectangle. Well, this one though, just to make things a little more interesting, is slipped beneath and partially hidden by the first. So you could think of it a bit like holding two cards fanned out in your hand. Once you've drawn it in with pencil, mix up a slightly darker mix of your first colour and paint around both objects. And the exercise continues like this. Add a third card, darken your mix or even alter its colour slightly if you wish, and then paint around all three objects. And repeat. What started out like a few playing cards quickly starts to look like something else. I like to call this exercise the cellar steps. Quick, easy exercises like this are good to practice on and hopefully help you to understand the basic underlying concepts. Once you've mastered it, maybe repeated it several times, perhaps switching the simple rectangle shape for something different, maybe something a little more challenging, perhaps like flower shapes or leaves. Once you're happy with all of that, it's time to have a go at applying the technique to something a bit more interesting. This small church in Kefalonia is quite bright against its surroundings. It's also a large enough shape to paint around without having to consider masking it out first. Although I have to say at this point that this doesn't mean you can't mask it out. You can mask out whatever you like, of course. If a shape is big enough and easy enough to work around, however, why put yourself to the trouble? One of the ways in which I use the negative painting technique almost religiously is when it comes to painting grass and tussocky foregrounds. Again, masking fluid or even scratching out is a strong option, but generating grass by working the dark tone into the lighter value and essentially between the grass blades, and simply thinking negatively is for me a more spontaneous solution. Naturally, some degree of care needs to be taken in order to maintain the illusion of grass, and there will be moments inevitably when you accidentally paint over some of the grasses and start wishing you'd masked them out after all. Generally speaking though, I rarely see this as a problem. Yes, there's a bit of a gamble involved, and yes, a steady hand is almost essential, but this isn't quite as precise a technique as it might first seem, and missing out the odd blade of grass or accidentally painting over it can actually help to generate a more random finish. The negative painting technique can also be used to create variations within the foliage of the trees. Instead of all the leaves being painted positively, a smattering of random highlights created by carefully painting the darker tone around them can help to make the foliage a little more visually interesting. Well, the big challenge here, of course, is to try and avoid creating any overtly repetitive patterns, otherwise the result won't look natural. And as with the grass, though, the technique is quite forgiving. If you do accidentally paint over a highlight, well, it's unlikely to make any substantial difference. In fact, it may just help with regards to keeping things looking random. So we've masked, scratched and negatively worked our way around a handful of highlights in slightly different painting scenarios. Which one you choose at any given point in time is going to depend almost entirely upon the effect you're trying to achieve. If it's precision you're after, then masking is probably going to be your best option, but if you've spontaneously decided your painting would benefit from a highlight or two, then negative painting or scratching out may suit you better. Well, if we think of this another way, masking is something we tend to pre-plan. Negative painting, on the other hand, is something we do on the fly, while scratching out is something we're most likely to do retrospectively. And creating highlights retrospectively is what I want to concentrate on in this final technique. Here I've hastily constructed a typical outdoor scene featuring some rocks. It could use some finesse, but it'll do for the purposes of this demonstration. And as you can see, I've already used negative painting to create a few grasses along the base of the nearest rocks. And all the rocks within the scene have been broken down, generally speaking, into 3 values. 4 if you include the untouched white highlights along their uppermost edges. What happens if I decide at this late stage that there are too many dark tones in the foreground? How can I change my mind and introduce a few light-toned rocks when in watercolour we paint from light to dark? You could, of course, use an opaque medium such as gouache to paint the rocks in, but the results are likely to be unsatisfactory. And I'm not suggesting that such practice is wrong. The end justifies the means and all that, but there is another simple solution. And that solution is lifting out. To create my rocks, I'm first going to draw the shape out on a piece of cardboard and cut it out with a pair of scissors or a knife. Placing the card on the paper where I want my rock to be located effectively creates a mask so that when I scrub at it with a damp, stiff, bristled brush, the adjacent area will be protected. While it's all still damp, the pigment can be lifted out with a piece of tissue or kitchen roll. It's worth noting that if you alter the pressure with the tissue, the highlight can even be graduated. Well, I should also say that lifting out doesn't always require a cardboard mask. It might be a larger area, for instance, or you might not want hard edges at all. It's great for lifting out smoke or fog, for instance. Well, there is just one last thing I want to add. Such highlights are never going to be quite as clean and bright as those produced using masking medium. The truth is, when you lift paint out in this way, no matter how fast you work or how much pressure you use, you'll always leave a little something behind. So there you have it, 4 tried and trusted techniques for creating highlights. Well, if you are new to watercolour, it's important to understand the importance of highlights and try to avoid a situation where you might be blindly ploughing on with your painting, oblivious to the fact that it's slowly turning to mud. Well, I'm going to be back with more watercolour basics very soon, so if you've enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button, and if you've not already done so, you might want to consider subscribing to my channel. More in-depth guidance and advice is of course available through my online tuition service. Details of how to subscribe to that are in the description below. In the meantime, keep watching what happens on the paper and enjoy. Until the next time, take care.